Part 0. Author's Note of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernst Patinama. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Author's Note. Nostromo is the most anxiously meditated of the longer novels which belong to the period following upon the publication of the Typhoon volume of short stories. I don't mean to say that I became then conscious of any impending change in my mentality and in my attitude towards the tasks of my writing life. And perhaps there was never any change, except in that mysterious, extraneous thing which has nothing to do with the theories of art. A subtle change in the nature of the inspiration, a phenomenon for which I cannot in any way be held responsible. What, however, did cause me some concern was that, after finishing the last story of the Typhoon volume, it seemed somehow that there was nothing more in the world to write about. This so strangely negative but disturbing mood lasted some little time, and then, as with many of my longer stories, the first hint for Nostromo came to me in the shape of a vagrant anecdote, completely destitute of valuable details. As a matter of fact, in 1875 or 6, when very young, in the West Indies, or rather in the Gulf of Mexico, for my contacts with land were short, few and fleeting, I heard the story of some man who was supposed to have stolen, single-handed, a whole lighter full of silver somewhere on the terra firma seaboard during the troubles of a revolution. On the face of it, this was something of a feat, but I heard no details, and, having no particular interest in crime qua crime, I was not likely to keep that one in my mind. And I forgot it, till 26 or 7 years afterwards I came upon the very thing in a shabby volume, picked up outside a second-hand bookshop. It was a life story of an American seaman, written by himself with the assistance of a journalist. In the course of his wanderings, that American sailor worked for some months on board a schooner, the master and owner of which was the thief of whom I had heard in my very young days. I have no doubt of that, because there could hardly have been two exploits of that peculiar kind in the same part of the world, and both connected with a South American revolution. The fellow had actually managed to steal a lighter with silver, and this, it seems, only because he was implicitly trusted by his employers, who must have been singularly poor judges of character. In the sailor's story he is represented as an unmitigated rascal, a small cheat, stupidly ferocious, morose, of mean appearance, and altogether unworthy of the greatness this opportunity had thrust upon him. What was interesting was that he would boast of it openly. He used to say, "People think I make a lot of money in this schooner of mine, but that is nothing. I don't care for that. Now and then I go away quietly and lift a bar of silver. I must get rich slowly, you understand." There was also another curious point about the man. Once, in the course of some quarrel, the sailor threatened him. What's to prevent me reporting ashore what you have told me about that silver? The cynical ruffian was not alarmed in the least. He actually laughed. "You fool! If you dare talk like that on shore about me, you will get a knife stuck in your back. Every man, woman, and child in that port is my friend, and who's to prove the lighter wasn't sunk? I didn't show you where the silver is hidden, did I? So you know nothing, and suppose I lied, eh?" Ultimately the sailor, disgusted with the sordid meanness of that impenitent thief, deserted from the schooner. The whole episode takes about 3 pages of his autobiography. Nothing to speak of, but as I looked them over, the curious confirmation of the few casual words, heard in my early youth, evoked the memories of that distant time when everything was so fresh, so surprising, so venturesome, so interesting, bits of strange coasts under the stars, shadows of hills in the sunshine, men's passions in the dusk, gossip half forgotten, faces grown dim. Perhaps there still was in the world something to write about. Yet I did not see anything at first in the mere story. A rascal steals a large parcel of a valuable commodity, so people say. It's either true or untrue, and in any case it has no value in itself. To invent a circumstantial account of the robbery did not appeal to me because, my talents not running that way, I did not think that the game was worth the candle. It was only when it dawned upon me that the purloiner of the treasure need not necessarily be a confirmed rogue, that he could be even a man of character, an actor, and possibly a victim in the changing seas of a revolution. It was only then that I had the first vision of a twilight country which was to become the province of Sulaco, with its high shadowy sierra and its misty campo, for mute witnesses of events flowing from the passions of men, short-sighted in good and evil. Such are in very truth the obscure origins of Nostromo, the book. From that moment I suppose it had to be. Yet even then I hesitated, as if warned by the instinct of self-preservation, from venturing on a distant and toilsome journey into a land full of intrigues and revolutions. But it had to be done. It took the best part of the years 1903 to do. With many intervals of renewed hesitation lest I should lose myself in the ever-enlarging vistas opening before me as I progressed deeper in my knowledge of the country. Often also, when I had thought myself to a standstill over the tangled-up affairs of the Republic, I would, figuratively speaking, pack my bag, rush away from Sulaco for a change of air, and write a few pages of The Mirror of the Sea. But generally, as I've said before, my sojourn on the continent of Latin America, famed for its hospitality, lasted for about 2 years. On my return I found, speaking somewhat in the style of Captain Gulliver, my family all well, my wife heartily glad to learn that the fuss was all over, and our small boy considerably grown during my absence. My principal authority for the history of Costaguana is, of course, my venerated friend, the late Don José Avellanos, minister to the courts of England and Spain, etc., etc., in his impartial and eloquent History of 50 Years of Misrule. That work was never published, the reader will discover why, and I am in fact the only person in the world possessed of its contents. I have mastered them in not a few hours of earnest meditation, and I hope that my accuracy will be trusted. In justice to myself, and to allay the fears of prospective readers, I beg to point out that the few historical allusions are never dragged in for the sake of parading my unique erudition, but that each of them is closely related to actuality, either throwing a light on the nature of current events or affecting directly the fortunes of the people of whom I speak. As to their own histories, I have tried to set them down, aristocracy and people, men and women, Latin and Anglo-Saxon, bandit and politician, with as cool a hand as was possible in the heat and clash of my own conflicting emotions. And after all, this is also the story of their conflicts. It is for the reader to say how far they are deserving of interest in their actions, and in the secret purposes of their hearts revealed in the bitter necessities of the time. I confess that, for me, that time is a time of firm friendships and unforgotten hospitalities, and in my gratitude I must mention here Mrs. Gould, the first lady of Sulaco, whom we may safely leave to the secret devotion of Dr. Monyngham, and Charles Gould, the idealist creator of material interests, whom we must leave to his mine, from which there is no escape in this world. About Nostromo, the second of the two racially and socially contrasted men, both captured by the silver of the San Tome mine, I feel bound to say something more. I did not hesitate to make that central figure an Italian. First of all, the thing is perfectly credible. Italians were swarming into the Occidental province at the time, as anybody who will read further can see, and secondly, there was no one who could stand so well by the side of Giorgio Viola the Garibaldino, the idealist of the old humanitarian revolutions. For myself, I needed there a man of the people, as free as possible from his class conventions and all settled modes of thinking. This is not a side snarl at conventions. My reasons were not moral but artistic. Had he been an Anglo-Saxon, he would have tried to get into local politics, but Nostromo does not aspire to be a leader in a personal game. He does not want to raise himself above the mass. He is content to feel himself a power within the people. But mainly Nostromo is what he is, because I received the inspiration for him in my early days from a Mediterranean sailor. Those who have read certain pages of mine will see at once what I mean when I say that Dominic, the padrone of the Tremolino, might under given circumstances have been a Nostromo. At any rate, Dominic would have understood the younger man perfectly, if scornfully. He and I were engaged together in a rather absurd adventure, but the absurdity does not matter. It is a real satisfaction to think that in my very young days there must, after all, have been something in me worthy to command that man's half-bitter fidelity, his half-ironic devotion. Many of Nostromo's speeches I have heard first in Dominic's voice, his hand on the tiller and his fearless eyes roaming the horizon from within the monkish hood shadowing his face. He would utter the usual exordium of his remorseless wisdom, "Vous autres gentilshommes," in a caustic tone that hangs on my ear yet. Like Nostromo, you hombres finos, very much like Nostromo. But Dominic the Corsican nursed a certain pride of ancestry from which my Nostromo is free, for Nostromo's lineage had to be more ancient still. He is a man with the weight of countless generations behind him, and no parentage to boast of, like the people. In his firm grip on the earth he inherits, in his improvidence and generosity, in his lavishness with his gifts, in his manly vanity, in the obscure sense of his greatness, and in his faithful devotion with something despairing as well as desperate in its impulses, he is a man of the people, their very own unenvious force, disdaining to lead but ruling from within. He is afterwards, grown older as the famous Captain Fidanza, with a stake in the country, going about his many affairs, followed by respectful glances in the modernized streets of Sulaco, calling on the widow of the cargador, attending the lodge, listening in unmoved silence to anarchist speeches at the meeting, the enigmatical patron of the new revolutionary agitation, the trusted, the wealthy comrade Fidanza, with the knowledge of his moral ruin locked up in his breast, he remains essentially a man of the people, in his mingled love and scorn of life, and in the bewildered conviction of having been betrayed, of dying betrayed he hardly knows by what or by whom. He is still of the people, their undoubted great man, with a private history of his own. One more figure of those stirring times I would like to mention, and that is Antonia Avellanos, the beautiful Antonia. Whether she is a possible variation of Latin American girlhood I wouldn't dare to affirm, but for me she is, always a little in the background by the side of her father, my venerated friend. I hope she has yet relief enough to make intelligible what I am going to say. Of all the people who had seen with me the birth of the Occidental Republic, she is the only one who has kept in my memory the aspect of continued life. Antonia the aristocrat and Nostromo, the man of the people, are the artisans of the new era, the true creators of the new estate, he by his legendary and daring feat, she, like a woman, simply by the force of what she is, the only being capable of inspiring a sincere passion in the heart of a trifler. If anything could induce me to revisit Sulaco, I should hate to see all these changes, it would be Antonia. And the true reason for that, why not be frank about it? The true reason is that I have modelled her on my first love. How we, a band of tallish schoolboys, the chums of her two brothers, how we used to look up to that girl, just out of the schoolroom herself, as a standard-bearer of a faith to which we all were born, but which she alone knew how to hold aloft with an unflinching hope. She had perhaps more glow and less serenity in her soul than Antonia, but she was an uncompromising Puritan of patriotism, with no taint of the slightest worldliness in her thoughts. I was not the only one in love with her, but it was I who had to hear oftenest her scathing criticism of my levities, very much like poor Decoud, or stand the brunt of her austere, unanswerable invective. She did not quite understand, but never mind. That afternoon when I came in, a shrinking yet defiant sinner, to say the final good-bye, I received a hand squeeze that made my heart leap, and saw a tear that took my breath away. She was softened at the last, as though she had suddenly perceived, we were such children still, that I was really going away for good, going very far away, even as far as Sulaco, lying unknown, hidden from our eyes in the darkness of the placid gulf. That's why I long sometimes for another glimpse of the beautiful Antonia, or can it be the other, moving in the dimness of the great cathedral, saying a short prayer at the tomb of the first and last Cardinal Archbishop of Sulaco, standing absorbed in filial devotion before the monument of Don José Avellanos, and with a lingering, tender, faithful glance at the medallion memorial to Martin Decoud, going out serenely into the sunshine of the plaza with our upright carriage and her white head, a relic of the past, disregarded by men awaiting impatiently the dawns of other new eras, the coming of more revolutions. But this is the idlest of dreams, for I did understand perfectly well at the time that, the moment the breath left the body of the magnificent capataz, the man of the people, freed at last from the toils of love and wealth, there was nothing more for me to do in Sulaco. J.C. October 1917. End of Part 0. Author's Note. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
Of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gesine. Nostromo, A Tale of the Seaboard, by Joseph Conrad. So foul a sky clears not without a storm. Shakespeare. Dedicated to John Galsworthy. Chapter 1. In the time of Spanish rule, and for many years afterwards, the town of Sulaco, the luxuriant beauty of the orange gardens bears witness to its antiquity, had never been commercially anything more important than a coasting port with a fairly large local trade in ox hides and indigo. The clumsy deep-sea galleons of the conquerors that, needing a brisk gale to move at all, would lie becalmed, where your modern ship built on clipper lines forges ahead by the mere flapping of her sails, had been barred out of Sulaco by the prevailing calms of its vast gulf. Some harbours of the earth are made difficult of access by the treachery of sunken rocks and the tempests of their shores. Sulaco had found an inviolable sanctuary from the temptations of a trading world in the solemn hush of the deep Golfo Placido, as within an enormous semicircular and unroofed temple open to the ocean, with its walls of lofty mountains hung with the morning draperies of cloud. On one side of this broad curve in the straight seaboard of the Republic of Costaguana, the last spur of the coast range forms an insignificant cape whose name is Punta Mala. From the middle of the gulf the point of the land itself is not visible at all, but the shoulder of a steep hill at the back can be made out faintly, like a shadow on the sky. On the other side, what seems to be an isolated patch of blue mist floats lightly on the glare of the horizon. This is the peninsula of Azuera, a wild chaos of sharp rocks and stony levels cut about by vertical ravines. It lies far out to sea, like a rough head of stone stretched from a green-clad coast at the end of a slender neck of sand covered with thickets of thorny scrub. Utterly waterless, for the rainfall runs off at once on all sides into the sea. It has not soil enough, it is said, to grow a single blade of grass, as if it were blighted by a curse. The poor, associating by an obscure instinct of consolation the ideas of evil and wealth, will tell you that it is deadly because of its forbidden treasures. The common folk of the neighbourhood, peons of the estancias, vaqueros of the seaboard plains, tame Indians coming miles to market with a bundle of sugar cane or a basket of maize worth about threepence, are well aware that heaps of shining gold lie in the gloom of the deep precipices cleaving the stony levels of Azuera. Tradition has it that many adventurers of olden time had perished in the search. The story also goes that within men's memory 2 wandering sailors, Americanos perhaps, but gringos of some sort for certain, talked over a gambling, good-for-nothing mozo, and the 3 stole a donkey to carry for them a bundle of dry sticks, a water-skin, and provisions enough to last a few days. Thus accompanied, and with revolvers at their belts, they had started to chop their way with machetes through the thorny scrub on the neck of the peninsula. On the second evening an upright spiral of smoke, it could only have been from their campfire, was seen for the first time within memory of man standing up faintly upon the sky, above a razor-backed ridge on the stony head. The crew of a coasting schooner, lying becalmed 3 miles off the shore, stared at it with amazement till dark. A negro fisherman, living in a lonely hut in a little bay near by, had seen the start and was on the lookout for some sign. He called to his wife just as the sun was about to set. They had watched the strange portent with envy, incredulity, and awe. The impious adventurers gave no other sign. The sailors, the Indian, and the stolen burro were never seen again. As to the mozo, a Sulaco man, his wife paid for some masses, and the poor 4-footed beast, being without sin, had been probably permitted to die, but the 2 gringos, spectral and alive, are believed to be dwelling to this day amongst the rocks, under the fatal spell of their success. Their souls cannot tear themselves away from their bodies, mounting guard over the discovered treasure. They are now rich and hungry and thirsty, a strange theory of tenacious gringo ghosts suffering in their starved and parched flesh of defiant heretics, where a Christian would have renounced and been released. These, then, are the legendary inhabitants of Azuera guarding its forbidden wealth, and the shadow on the sky on the one side, with the round patch of blue haze blurring the bright skirt of the horizon on the other, mark the 2 outermost points on the bend which bears the name of Golfo Placido, because never a strong wind had been known to blow upon its waters. On crossing the imaginary line drawn from Punta Mala to Azuera, the ships from Europe bound to Sulaco lose at once the strong breezes of the ocean. They become the prey of capricious airs that play with them for 30 hours at a stretch sometimes. Before them the head of the calm gulf is filled on most days of the year by a great body of motionless and opaque clouds. On the rare clear mornings another shadow is cast upon the sweep of the gulf. The dawn breaks high behind the towering and serrated wall of the Cordillera, a clear-cut vision of dark peaks rearing their steep slopes on a lofty pedestal of forest rising from the very edge of the shore. Amongst them the white head of Higuerota rises majestically upon the blue. Bare clusters of enormous rocks sprinkle with tiny black dots the smooth dome of snow. Then, as the midday sun withdraws from the gulf the shadow of the mountains, the clouds begin to roll out of the lower valleys. They swathe in sombre tatters the naked crags of precipices above the wooded slopes, hide the peaks, smoke in stormy trails across the snows of Higuerota. The Cordillera is gone from you as if it had dissolved itself into great piles of grey and black vapours that travel out slowly to seaward and vanish into thin air all along the front before the blazing heat of the day. The wasting edge of the cloud bank always strives for, but seldom wins, the middle of the gulf. The sun, as the sailors say, is eating it up. Unless perchance a sombre thunderhead breaks away from the main body, to career all over the gulf till it escapes into the offing beyond Azuera, where it bursts suddenly into flame and crashes like a sinister pirate ship of the air, hove to above the horizon, engaging the sea. At night the body of clouds advancing higher up the sky smothers the whole quiet gulf below with an impenetrable darkness, in which the sound of the falling showers can be heard beginning and ceasing abruptly, now here, now there. Indeed, these cloudy nights are proverbial with the seamen along the whole west coast of a great continent. Sky, land, and sea disappear together out of the world when the Placido, as the saying is, goes to sleep under its black poncho. The few stars left below the seaward frown of the vault shine feebly as into the mouth of a black cavern. In its vastness your ship floats unseen under your feet, her sails flutter invisible above your head. The eye of God himself, they add with grim profanity, could not find out what work a man's hand is doing in there, and you would be free to call the devil to your aid with impunity, if even his malice were not defeated by such a blind darkness. The shores on the gulf are steep too, all round, 3 uninhabited islets baking in the sunshine just outside the cloud veil, and opposite the entrance to the harbour of Sulaco, bear the name of the Isabels. There is the Great Isabel, the Little Isabel, which is round, and Hermosa, which is the smallest. That last is no more than a foot high, and about 7 paces across, a mere flat top of a grey rock, which smokes like a hot cinder after a shower, and where no man would care to venture a naked soul before sunset. On the Little Isabel an old ragged palm, with a thick bulging trunk rough with spines, a very witch among palm trees, rustles a dismal bunch of dead leaves above the coarse sand. The Great Isabel has a spring of fresh water issuing from the overgrown side of a ravine. Resembling an emerald green wedge of land a mile long and laid flat upon the sea, it bears 2 forest trees standing close together, with a wide spread of shade at the foot of their smooth trunks. A ravine extending the whole length of the island is full of bushes, and, presenting a deep tangled cleft on the high side, spreads itself out on the other into a shallow depression abutting on a small strip of sandy shore. From that low end of the Great Isabel the eye plunges through an opening 2 miles away, as abrupt as if chopped with an axe out of the regular sweep of the coast, right into the harbour of Sulaco. It is an oblong, lake-like piece of water. On one side the short wooded spurs and valleys of the Cordillera come down at right angles to the very strand, on the other the open view of the great Sulaco plain passes into the opal mystery of great distances overhung by dry haze. The town of Sulaco itself, tops of walls, a great cupola, gleams of white miradors in a vast grove of orange trees, lies between the mountains and the plain, at some little distance from its harbour and out of the direct line of sight from the sea. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Nostromo, A Tale of the Seaboard, by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 2. The only sign of commercial activity within the harbour, visible from the beach of the Great Isabel, is the square, blunt end of the wooden jetty which the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, the O.S.N. of familiar speech, had thrown over the shallow part of the bay soon after they had resolved to make of Sulaco one of their ports of call for the Republic of Costaguana. The state possesses several harbours on its long seaboard, but except Cayta, an important place, all are either small and inconvenient inlets in an iron-bound coast, like Esmeralda, for instance, 60 miles to the north, or else mere open roadsteads exposed to the winds and fretted by the surf. Perhaps the very atmospheric conditions which had kept away the merchant fleets of bygone ages induced the O.S.N. Company to violate the sanctuary of peace sheltering the calm existence of Sulaco. The variable airs sporting lightly with the vast semicircle of waters within the head of Azuera could not baffle the steam power of their excellent fleet. Year after year the black hulls of their ships had gone up and down the coast, in and out, past Azuera, past the Isabels, past Punta Mala, disregarding everything but the tyranny of time. Their names, the names of all mythology, became the household words of a coast that had never been ruled by the gods of Olympus. The Juno was known only for her comfortable cabins amidships, the Saturn for the geniality of her captain and the painted and gilt luxuriousness of her saloon, whereas the Ganymede was fitted out mainly for cattle transport and to be avoided by coastwise passengers. The humblest Indian in the obscurest village on the coast was familiar with the Cerberus, a little black puffer without charm or living accommodation to speak of, whose mission was to creep inshore along the wooded beaches close to mighty ugly rocks, stopping obligingly before every cluster of huts to collect produce, down to 3-pound parcels of India rubber bound in a wrapper of dry grass. And as they seldom failed to account for the smallest package, rarely lost a bullock, and had never drowned a single passenger, the name of the O.S.N. stood very high for trustworthiness. People declared that under the company's care their lives and property were safer on the water than in their own houses on shore. The O.S.N.'s superintendent in Sulaco for the whole Costaguana section of the service was very proud of his company's standing. He resumed it in a saying which was very often on his lips: "We never make mistakes." To the company's officers it took the form of a severe injunction: "We must make no mistakes. I'll have no mistakes here, no matter what Smith may do at his end." Smith, on whom he had never set eyes in his life, was the other superintendent of the service, quartered some 1,500 miles away from Sulaco. "Don't talk to me of your Smith." Then, calming down suddenly, he would dismiss the subject with studied negligence. "Smith knows no more of this continent than a baby." Our excellent Señor Mitchell, for the business and official world of Sulaco; Fussy Joe, for the commanders of the company's ships. Captain Joseph Mitchell prided himself on his profound knowledge of men and things in the country, cosas de Costaguana. Amongst these last he accounted as most unfavourable to the orderly working of his company the frequent changes of government brought about by revolutions of the military type. The political atmosphere of the Republic was generally stormy in these days. The fugitive patriots of the defeated party had the knack of turning up again on the coast with half a steamer's load of small arms and ammunition. Such resourcefulness Captain Mitchell considered as perfectly wonderful in view of their utter destitution at the time of flight. He had observed that "they never seemed to have enough change about them to pay for their passage ticket out of the country." And he could speak with knowledge, for on a memorable occasion he had been called upon to save the life of a dictator, together with the lives of a few Sulaco officials, the political chief, the director of the customs, and the head of police, belonging to an overturned government. Poor Señor Ribierist, such was the dictator's name, had come pelting 80 miles over mountain tracks after the lost battle of Socorro, in the hope of outdistancing the fatal news, which, of course, he could not manage to do on a lame mule. The animal, moreover, expired under him at the end of the Alameda, where the military band plays sometimes in the evenings between the revolutions. "Sir," Captain Mitchell would pursue with portentous gravity, "the ill-timed end of that mule attracted attention to the unfortunate rider. His features were recognized by several deserters from the dictatorial army, amongst the rascally mob already engaged in smashing the windows of the Intendencia." Early on the morning of that day, the local authorities of Sulaco had fled for refuge to the O.S.N. Company's offices, a strong building near the shore end of the jetty, leaving the town to the mercies of a revolutionary rabble, and as the dictator was execrated by the populace on account of the severe recruitment law his necessities had compelled him to enforce during the struggle, he stood a good chance of being torn to pieces. Providentially, Nostromo, invaluable fellow, with some Italian workmen, imported to work upon the National Central Railway, was at hand, and managed to snatch him away, for the time at least. Ultimately, Captain Mitchell succeeded in taking everybody off in his own gig to one of the company's steamers. It was the Minerva, just then, as luck would have it, entering the harbour. He had to lower these gentlemen at the end of a rope out of a hole in the wall at the back, while the mob which, pouring out of the town, had spread itself all along the shore, howled and foamed at the foot of the building in front. He had to hurry them, then, the whole length of the jetty. It had been a desperate dash, neck or nothing, and again it was Nostromo, a fellow in 1,000, who at the head, this time, of the company's body of lightermen, held the jetty against the rushes of the rabble, thus giving the fugitives time to reach the gig lying ready for them at the other end with the steamer's flag at the stern. Sticks, stones, shots flew. Knives, too, were thrown. Captain Mitchell exhibited willingly the long cicatrice of a cut over his left ear and temple, made by a razor blade fastened to a stick, a weapon, he explained, very much in favour with the worst kind of nigger out here. Captain Mitchell was a thick, elderly man, wearing high pointed collars and short side whiskers, partial to white waistcoats, and really very communicative under his air of pompous reserve. "These gentlemen," he would say, staring with great solemnity, "had to run like rabbits, sir. I ran like a rabbit myself. Certain forms of death are distasteful to a respectable man. They would have pounded me to death, too. A crazy mob, sir, does not discriminate. Under Providence we owed our preservation to my capataz de cargadores, as they called him in the town, a man who, when I discovered his value, sir, was just the boatswain of an Italian ship, a big Genoese ship, one of the few European ships that ever came to Sulaco with a general cargo before the building of the National Central. He left her on account of some very respectable friends he made here, his own countrymen, but also, I suppose, to better himself. Sir, I am a pretty good judge of character. I engaged him to be the foreman of our lightermen and caretaker of our jetty. That's all that he was. But without him, Señor Ribierist would have been a dead man. This Nostromo, sir, a man absolutely above reproach, became the terror of all the thieves in the town. We were infested, overrun, sir, here at that time by ladrones and matreros, thieves and murderers from the whole province. On this occasion they had been flocking into Sulaco for a week past. They had scented the end, sir. 50% of that murdering mob were professional bandits from the Campo, sir, but there wasn't one that hadn't heard of Nostromo. As to the town Leperos, sir, the sight of his black whiskers and white teeth was enough for them. They quailed before him, sir. That's what the force of character will do for you." It could very well be said that it was Nostromo alone who saved the lives of these gentlemen. Captain Mitchell, on his part, never left them till he had seen them collapse, panting, terrified and exasperated, but safe, on the luxuriant velvet sofas in the first-class saloon of the Minerva. To the very last he had been careful to address the ex-dictator as "Your Excellency." "Sir, I could do no other. The man was down, ghastly, livid, one mass of scratches." The Minerva never let go her anchor that call. The superintendent ordered her out of the harbour at once. No cargo could be landed, of course, and the passengers for Sulaco naturally refused to go ashore. They could hear the firing and see plainly the fight going on at the edge of the water. The repulsed mob devoted its energies to an attack upon the Custom House, a dreary, unfinished-looking structure with many windows, 200 yards away from the O.S.N. offices, and the only other building near the harbour. Captain Mitchell, after directing the commander of the Minerva to land "these gentlemen" in the first port of call outside Costaguana, went back to his gig to see what could be done for the protection of the company's property. That and the property of the railway were preserved by the European residents, that is, by Captain Mitchell himself and the staff of engineers building the road, aided by the Italian and Basque workmen who rallied faithfully round their English chiefs. The company's lightermen, too, natives of the Republic, behaved very well under their capataz. An outcast lot of very mixed blood, mainly negroes, everlasting at feud with the other customers of low grog shops in the town, they embraced with delight this opportunity to settle their personal scores under such favourable auspices. There was not one of them that had not, at some time or other, looked with terror at Nostromo's revolver poked very close at his face, or been otherwise daunted by Nostromo's resolution. He was "much of a man," their capataz was, they said, too scornful in his temper ever to utter abuse, a tireless taskmaster, and the more to be feared because of his aloofness. And behold, there he was that day, at their head, condescending to make jocular remarks to this man or the other. Such leadership was inspiriting, and in truth all the harm the mob managed to achieve was to set fire to one, only one, stack of railway sleepers, which, being creosoted, burned well. The main attack on the railway yards, on the O.S.N. offices, and especially on the Custom House, whose strong room it was well known contained a large treasure in silver ingots, failed completely. Even the little hotel kept by old Giorgio, standing alone halfway between the harbour and the town, escaped looting and destruction, not by a miracle, but because with the safes in view they had neglected it at first, and afterwards found no leisure to stop. Nostromo with his cargadores was pressing them too hard then. Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part First. The Silver of the Mine. Chapter 3. It might have been said that there he was only protecting his own. From the first he had been admitted to live in the intimacy of the family of the hotel keeper, who was a countryman of his. Old Giorgio Viola, a Genoese with a shaggy white leonine head, often called simply the Garibaldino, as Mohammedans are called after their prophet, was, to use Captain Mitchell's own words, the respectable married friend by whose advice Nostromo had left his ship to try for a run of shore luck in Costaguana. The old man, full of scorn for the populace, as your austere republican so often is, had disregarded the preliminary sounds of trouble. He went on that day as usual, pottering about the casa in his slippers, muttering angrily to himself his contempt of the non-political nature of the riot, and shrugging his shoulders. In the end he was taken unawares by the outrush of the rabble. It was too late then to remove his family, and, indeed, where could he have run to with the portly Signora Teresa and 2 little girls on that great plain? So, barricading every opening, the old man sat down sternly in the middle of the darkened cafe with an old shotgun on his knees. His wife sat on another chair by his side, muttering pious invocations to all the saints of the calendar. The old republican did not believe in saints, or in prayers, or in what he called priest's religion. Liberty and Garibaldi were his divinities, but he tolerated superstition in women, preserving in these matters a lofty and silent attitude. His 2 girls, the eldest 14 and the other 2 years younger, crouched on the sanded floor on each side of the Signora Teresa, with their heads on their mother's lap, both scared, but each in her own way, the dark-haired Linda indignant and angry, the fair Giselle, the younger, bewildered and resigned. The patrona removed her arms, which embraced her daughters, for a moment to cross herself and wring her hands hurriedly. She moaned a little louder. "Oh, Gian' Battista, why art thou not here? Oh, why art thou not here?" She was not then invoking the saint himself, but calling upon Nostromo, whose patron he was, and Giorgio, motionless on the chair by her side, would be provoked by these reproachful and distracted appeals. "Peace, woman. Where's the sense of it? There's his duty," he murmured in the dark, and she would retort, panting, I have no patience. Duty! What of the woman who has been like a mother to him? I bent my knee to him this morning. Don't you go out, Gian' Battista. Stop in the house, Battistino. Look at those 2 little innocent children." Mrs. Viola was an Italian, too, a native of Spezia, and though considerably younger than her husband, already middle-aged, she had a handsome face, whose complexion had turned yellow because the climate of Sulaco did not suit her at all. Her voice was a rich contralto, when with her arms folded tight under her ample bosom she scolded the squat, thick-legged China girls handling linen, plucking fowls, pounding corn in wooden mortars amongst the mud outbuildings at the back of the house. She could bring out such an impassioned, vibrating, sepulchral note that the chained watchdog bolted into his kennel with a great rattle. Luis, a cinnamon-coloured mulatto with a sprouting moustache and thick, dark lips, would stop sweeping the cafe with a broom of palm leaves to let a gentle shudder run down his spine. His languishing almond eyes would remain closed for a long time. This was the staff of the Casa Viola. But all these people had fled early that morning at the first sounds of the riot, preferring to hide on the plain rather than trust themselves in the house, a preference for which they were in no way to blame, since, whether it true or not, it was generally believed in the town that the Garibaldino had some money buried under the clay floor of the kitchen. The dog, an irritable, shaggy brute, barked violently and whined plaintively, in turns at the back, running in and out of his kennel as rage or fear prompted him. Bursts of great shouting rose and died away like wild gusts of wind on the plain round the barricaded house. The fitful popping of shots grew louder above the yelling. Sometimes there were intervals of unaccountable stillness outside, and nothing could have been more gaily peaceful than the narrow bright lines of sunlight from the cracks in the shutters, ruled straight across the cafe over the disarranged chairs and tables to the wall opposite. Old Giorgio had chosen that bare whitewashed room for a retreat. It had only one window, and its only door swung out upon the track of thick dust fenced by aloe hedges between the harbour and the town, where clumsy carts used to creak along behind slow yokes of oxen guided by boys on horseback. In a pause of stillness Giorgio cocked his gun. The ominous sound wrung a low moan from the rigid figure of the woman sitting by his side. A sudden outbreak of defiant yelling quite near the house sank all at once to a confused murmur of growls. Somebody ran along, the loud catching of his breath was heard for an instant passing the door. There were hoarse mutters and footsteps near the wall. A shoulder rubbed against the shutter, effacing the bright lines of sunshine penciled across the whole breadth of the room. Signora Teresa's arms, thrown about the kneeling forms of her daughters, embraced them closer with a convulsive pressure. The mob, driven away from the custom house, had broken up into several bands, retreating across the plain in the direction of the town. The subdued crash of irregular volleys fired in the distance was answered by faint yells far away. In the intervals the single shots rang feebly, and the low, long white building, blinded in every window, seemed to be the centre of a turmoil widening in a great circle about its closed-up silence. But the cautious movements and whispers of a routed party seeking a momentary shelter behind the wall made the darkness of the room, striped by threads of quiet sunlight, alight with evil, stealthy sounds. The Violas had them in their ears, as though invisible ghosts hovering about their chairs had consulted in mutters as to the advisability of setting fire to this foreigner's casa. It was trying to the nerves. Old Viola had risen slowly, gun in hand, irresolute, for he did not see how he could prevent them. Already voices could be heard talking at the back. Signora Teresa was beside herself with terror. "Ah, the traitor, the traitor!" she mumbled almost inaudibly. "Now we are going to be burnt, and I bent my knee to him. No, he must run at the heels of his English." She seemed to think that Nostromo's mere presence in the house would have made it perfectly safe. So far, she too was under the spell of that reputation the capataz de cargadores had made for himself by the waterside, along the railway line, with the English and with the populace of Sulaco. To his face, and even against her husband, she invariably affected to laugh it to scorn, sometimes good-naturedly, more often with a curious bitterness. But then women are unreasonable in their opinions, as Giorgio used to remark calmly on fitting occasions. On this occasion, with his gun held at ready before him, he stooped down to his wife's head, and keeping his eyes steadfastly on the barricaded door, he breathed out into her ear that Nostromo would have been powerless to help. What could two men shut up in a house do against 20 or more bent upon setting fire to the roof? Gian' Battista was thinking of the casa all the time, he was sure. "He think of the casa! He!" gasped Signora Viola crazily. She struck her breast with her open hands. "I know him. He thinks of nobody but himself." A discharge of firearms near by made her throw her head back and close her eyes. Old Giorgio set his teeth hard under his white moustache, and his eyes began to roll fiercely. Several bullets struck the end of the wall together. Pieces of plaster could be heard falling outside. A voice screamed, "Here they come!" And after a moment of uneasy silence there was a rush of running feet along the front. Then the tension of old Giorgio's attitude relaxed, and a smile of contemptuous relief came upon his lips, of an old fighter with a leonine face. These were not a people striving for justice, but thieves. Even to defend his life against them was a sort of degradation for a man who had been one of Garibaldi's immortal thousand in the conquest of Sicily. He had an immense scorn for this outbreak of scoundrels and leperos who did not know the meaning of the word liberty. He grounded his old gun, and turning his head, glanced at the coloured lithograph of Garibaldi in a black frame on the white wall. A thread of strong sunshine cut it perpendicularly. His eyes, accustomed to the luminous twilight, made out the high colouring of the face, the red of the shirt, the outlines of the square shoulders, the black patch of the Bersaglieri hat with cock's feathers curling over the crown. An immortal hero! This was your liberty. It gave you not only life, but immortality as well. For that one man his fanaticism had suffered no diminution. In the moment of relief from the apprehension of the greatest danger perhaps his family had been exposed to in all their wanderings, he had turned to the picture of his old chief, first and only, then laid his hand on his wife's shoulder. The children kneeling on the floor had not moved. Signora Teresa opened her eyes a little, as though he had awakened her from a very deep and dreamless slumber. Before he had time in his deliberate way to say a reassuring word, she jumped up, with the children clinging to her, one on each side, gasped for breath, and let out a hoarse shriek. It was simultaneous with the bang of a violent blow struck on the outside of the shutter. They could hear suddenly the snorting of a horse, the restive tramping of hoofs on the narrow, hard path in front of the house. The toe of a boot struck at the shutter again, a spur jingled at every blow, and an excited voice shouted, "Hola! Hola in there!" End of chapter 3. First, Chapter 4 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part First. The Silver of the Mine. Chapter 4. All the morning Nostromo had kept his eye from afar on the Casa Viola. even in the thick of the hottest scrimmage near the custom-house. "If I see smoke rising over there," he thought to himself, "they are lost." Directly the mob had broken he pressed with a small band of Italian workmen in that direction, which indeed was the shortest line towards the town. That part of the rabble he was pursuing seemed to think of making a stand under the house. A volley fired by his followers from behind an aloe hedge made the rascals fly. In a gap chopped out for the rails of the harbour branch line, Nostromo appeared, mounted on his silver-grey mare. He shouted, sent after them one shot from his revolver, and galloped up to the cafe window. He had an idea that old Giorgio would choose that part of the house for a refuge. His voice had penetrated to them, sounding breathlessly hurried. "Hola, Vecchio! Oh, Vecchio! Is it all well with you in there?" "You see," murmured old Viola to his wife. Signora Teresa was silent now. Outside Nostromo laughed. "I can hear the patrona is not dead." "You have done your best to kill me with fear," cried Signora Teresa. She wanted to say something more, but her voice failed her. Linda raised her eyes to her face for a moment, but old Giorgio shouted apologetically, "She's a little upset." Outside Nostromo shouted back with another laugh, "She cannot upset me." Signora Teresa found her voice. "It is what I say. You have no heart, and you have no conscience, Giambattista." They heard him wheel his horse away from the shutters. The party he led were babbling excitedly in Italian and Spanish, inciting each other to the pursuit. He put himself at their head, crying, "Avanti!" "He has not stopped very long with us. There is no praise from strangers to be got here," Signora Teresa said tragically. "Avanti! Yes, that is all he cares for. To be first somewhere, somehow, to be first with these English. They will be showing him to everybody. This is our Nostromo," she laughed ominously. "What a name! What is that? Nostromo. He would take a name that is properly no word from them." Meantime Giorgio, with tranquil movements, had been unfastening the door. The flood of light fell on Signora Teresa, with her two girls gathered to her side, a picturesque woman in a pose of maternal exaltation. Behind her the wall was dazzlingly white, and the crude colours of the Garibaldi lithograph paled in the sunshine. Old Viola, at the door, moved his arm upwards as if referring all his quick fleeting thoughts to the picture of his old chief on the wall. Even when he was cooking for the Signori Inglesi, the engineers, he was a famous cook, though the kitchen was a dark place. He was, as it were, under the eye of the great man who had led him in a glorious struggle where, under the walls of Gaeta, tyranny would have expired forever had it not been for that accursed Piedmontese race of kings and ministers. When sometimes a frying-pan caught fire during a delicate operation with some shredded onions, and the old man was seen backing out of the doorway, swearing and coughing violently in an acrid cloud of smoke, the name of Cavour, the arch-intriguer sold to kings and tyrants, could be heard involved in imprecations against the China girls, cooking in general, and the brute of a country where he was reduced to live for the love of liberty that traitor had strangled. Then Signora Teresa, all in black, issuing from another door, advanced, portly and anxious, inclining her fine black-browed head, opening her arms, and crying in a profound tone, "Giorgio, thou passionate man! Misericordia divina! In the sun like this he will make himself ill." At her feet the hens made off in all directions with immense strides. If there were any engineers from up the line staying in Sulaco, a young English face or two would appear at the billiard-room occupying one end of the house. But at the other end, in the cafe, Luis, the mulatto, took good care not to show himself. The Indian girls, with hair like flowing black manes and dressed only in a shift and short petticoat, stared dully from under the square-cut fringes on their foreheads. The noisy frizzling of fat had stopped. The fumes floated upwards in the sunshine. A strong smell of burnt onions hung in the drowsy heat, enveloping the house, and the eye lost itself in a vast flat expanse of grass to the west, as if the plain between the Sierra overtopping Sulaco and the coast range away there towards Esmeralda had been as big as half the world. Signora Teresa, after an impressive pause, remonstrated. Giorgio, leave Cavour alone and take care of yourself. Now we are lost in this country all alone, with the two children, because you cannot live under a king." And while she looked at him, she would sometimes put her hand hastily to her side, with a short twitch of her fine lips and a knitting of her black straight eyebrows, like a flicker of angry pain or an angry thought on her handsome, regular features. It was pain. She suppressed the twinge. It had come to her first a few years after they had left Italy to emigrate to America and settle at last in Sulaco after wandering from town to town, trying shopkeeping in a small way here and there, and once an organized enterprise of fishing in Maldonado, for Giorgio, like the great Garibaldi, had been a sailor in his time. Sometimes she had no patience with pain. For years its gnawing had been part of the landscape, embracing the glitter of the harbour under the wooded spurs of the range. And the sunshine itself was heavy and dull, heavy with pain, not like the sunshine of her girlhood in which middle-aged Giorgio had wooed her gravely and passionately on the shores of the Gulf of Spezia. "You go in at once, Giorgio," she directed. "One would think you did not wish to have any pity on me, with 4 signori Inglesi staying in the house." Va bene, Giorgio would mutter. He obeyed. The signori Inglesi would require their midday meal presently. He had been one of the immortal and invincible band of liberators who had made the mercenaries of tyranny fly like chaff before a hurricane, un uragano terribile. But that was before he was married and had children, and before tyranny had reared its head again amongst the traitors who had imprisoned Garibaldi, his hero. There were 3 doors in the front of the house, and each afternoon the Garibaldino could be seen at one or another of them with his big bush of white hair, his arms folded, his legs crossed, leaning back his leonine head against the side, and looking up the wooded slopes of the foothills at the snowy dome of Higuerota. The front of his house threw off a black long rectangle of shade, broadening slowly over the soft ox-cart track. Through the gaps chopped out in the oleander hedges, the harbour branch railway, laid out temporarily on the level of the plain, curved away its shining parallel ribbons on a belt of scorched and withered grass within 60 yards of the end of the house. In the evening the empty material trains of flat cars circled round the dark green grove of Sulaco, and ran undulating slightly with white jets of steam over the plain towards the Casa Viola, on their way to the railway yards by the harbour. The Italian drivers saluted him from the footplate with raised hand, while the negro brakesmen sat carelessly on the brakes, looking straight forward, with the rims of their big hats flapping in the wind. In return Giorgio would give a slight sideways jerk of the head without unfolding his arms. On this memorable day of the riot his arms were not folded on his chest. His hand grasped the barrel of the gun grounded on the threshold. He did not look up once at the white dome of Higuerota, whose cool purity seemed to hold itself aloof from a hot earth. His eyes examined the plain curiously. Tall trails of dust subsided here and there. In a speckless sky the sun hung clear and blinding. Knots of men ran headlong, others made a stand, and the irregular rattle of firearms came rippling to his ears in the fiery still air. Single figures on foot raced desperately. Horsemen galloped towards each other, wheeled round together, separated at speed. Giorgio saw one fall, rider and horse disappearing as if they had galloped into a chasm. And the movements of the animated scene were like passages of a violent game played upon the plain by dwarfs mounted and on foot, yelling with tiny throats under the mountain that seemed a colossal embodiment of silence. Never before had Giorgio seen this bit of plain so full of active life. His gaze could not take in all its details at once. He shaded his eyes with his hand, till suddenly the thundering of many hoofs near by startled him. A troop of horses had broken out of the fenced paddock of the railway company. They came on like a whirlwind, and dashed over the line, snorting, kicking, squealing in a compact, piebald, tossing mob of bay, brown, grey backs, eyes staring, necks extended, nostrils red, long tails streaming. As soon as they had leaped upon the road, the thick dust flew upwards from under their hoofs, and within 6 yards of Giorgio only a brown cloud with vague forms of necks and cruppers rolled by, making the soil tremble on its passage. Viola coughed, turning his face away from the dust and shaking his head slightly. "There will be some horse catching to be done before tonight," he muttered. In the square of sunlight falling through the door, Signora Teresa, kneeling before the chair, had bowed her head, heavy with a twisted mass of ebony hair streaked with silver, into the palm of her hands. The black lace shawl she used to drape around her face had dropped to the ground by her side. The 2 girls had got up hand in hand in short skirts, their loose hair falling in disorder. The younger had thrown her arm across her eyes as if afraid to face the light. Linda, with her hand on the other's shoulder, stared fearlessly. Viola looked at his children. The sun brought out the deep lines on his face, and energetic in expression it had the immobility of a carving. It was impossible to discover what he thought. Bushy grey eyebrows shaded his dark glance. "Well, and do you not pray like your mother?" Linda pouted, advancing her red lips, which were almost too red. But she had admirable eyes, brown, with a sparkle of gold in the irises, full of intelligence and meaning, and so clear that they seemed to throw a glow upon her thin, colourless face. There were bronze glints in the sombre clusters of her hair, and the eyelashes, long and coal black, made her complexion appear still more pale. "Mother is going to offer up a lot of candles in the church. She always does when Nostromo has been away fighting. I shall have some to carry up to the chapel of the Madonna in the cathedral." She said all this quickly, with great assurance, and in an animated, penetrating voice. Then, giving her sister's shoulder a slight shake, she added, "And she will be made to carry one too." "Why made?" inquired Giorgio gravely. "Does she not want to?" "She is timid," said Linda, with a little burst of laughter. "People notice her fair hair as she goes along with us. They call out after her, 'Look at the Rubia! Look at the Rubiacita!' They call out in the streets. She is timid." "And you are not timid, eh?" the father pronounced slowly. She tossed back all her dark hair. "Nobody calls out after me." Old Giorgio contemplated his children thoughtfully. There was 2 years' difference between them. They had been born to him late, years after the boy had died. Had he lived, he would have been nearly as old as Gian' Battista, he whom the English called Nostromo. But as to his daughters, the severity of his temper, his advancing age, his absorption in his memories, had prevented his taking much notice of them. He loved his children, but girls belong more to the mother, and much of his affection had been expended in the worship and service of liberty. When quite a youth he had deserted from a ship trading to La Plata to enlist in the navy of Montevideo, then under the command of Garibaldi. Afterwards, in the Italian Legion of the Republic struggling against the encroaching tyranny of Rosas, he had taken part on great plains, on the banks of immense rivers, in the fiercest fighting perhaps the world had ever known. He had lived amongst men who had declaimed about liberty, suffered for liberty, died for liberty, with a desperate exultation, and with their eyes turned towards an oppressed Italy. His own enthusiasm had been fed on scenes of carnage, on the examples of lofty devotion, on the din of armed struggle, on the inflamed language of proclamations. He had never parted from the chief of his choice, the fiery apostle of independence, keeping by his side in America and in Italy till after the fatal day of Aspromonte, when the treachery of kings, emperors, and ministers had been revealed to the world in the wounding and imprisonment of his hero, a catastrophe that had instilled into him a gloomy doubt of ever being able to understand the ways of divine justice. He did not deny it, however. It required patience, he would say. Though he disliked priests, and would not put his foot inside a church for anything, he believed in God. Were not the proclamations against tyrants addressed to the peoples in the name of God and liberty? God for men, religions for women, he muttered sometimes. In Sicily, an Englishman who had turned up in Palermo after its evacuation by the army of the king had given him a Bible in Italian, the publication of the British and Foreign Bible Society, bound in a dark leather cover. In periods of political adversity, in the pauses of silence when the revolutionists issued no proclamations, Giorgio earned his living with the first work that came to hand, as sailor, as dock labourer on the quays of Genoa, once as a hand on a farm in the hills above Spezia, and in his spare time he studied the thick volume. He carried it with him into battles. Now it was his only reading, and in order not to be deprived of it, the print was small. He had consented to accept the present of a pair of silver-mounted spectacles from Senora Emilia Gould, the wife of the Englishman who managed the silver mine in the mountains 3 leagues from town. She was the only Englishwoman in Sulaco. Giorgio Viola had a great consideration for the English. This feeling, born on the battlefields of Uruguay, was 40 years old at the very least. Several of them had poured their blood for the cause of freedom in America, and the first he had ever known he remembered by the name of Samuel. He commanded a Negro company under Garibaldi during the famous siege of Montevideo, and died heroically with his Negroes at the fording of the Boyana. He, Giorgio, had reached the rank of ensign alferez, and cooked for the general. Later, in Italy, he, with the rank of lieutenant, rode with the staff and still cooked for the general. He had cooked for him in Lombardy through the whole campaign. On the march to Rome he had lassoed his beef in the Campana after the American manner. He had been wounded in the defence of the Roman Republic. He was one of the 4 fugitives who, with the general, carried out of the woods the inanimate body of the general's wife into the farmhouse where she died, exhausted by the hardships of that terrible retreat. He had survived that disastrous time to attend his general in Palermo when the Neapolitan shells from the castle crashed upon the town. He had cooked for him on the field of Volturno after fighting all day, and everywhere he had seen Englishmen in the front rank of the army of freedom. He respected their nation because they loved Garibaldi. Their very countesses and princesses had kissed the general's hands in London, it was said. He could well believe it, for the nation was noble, and the man was a saint. It was enough to look once at his face to see the divine force of faith in him, and his great pity for all that was poor, suffering, and oppressed in this world. The spirit of self-forgetfulness, the simple devotion to a vast humanitarian idea, which inspired the thought and stress of that revolutionary time, had left its mark upon Giorgio in a sort of austere contempt for all personal advantage. This man, whom the lowest class in Sulaco suspected of having a buried hoard in his kitchen, had all his life despised money. The leaders of his youth had lived poor, had died poor. It had been a habit of his mind to disregard tomorrow. It was engendered partly by an existence of excitement, adventure, and wild warfare, but mostly it was a matter of principle. It did not resemble the carelessness of a condottiere. It was a puritanism of conduct, born of stern enthusiasm like the puritanism of religion. This stern devotion to a cause had cast a gloom upon Giorgio's old age. It cast a gloom because the cause seemed lost. Too many kings and emperors flourished yet in the world which God had meant for the people. He was sad because of his simplicity. Though always ready to help his countrymen and greatly respected by the Italian emigrants wherever he lived, in his exile he called it, he could not conceal from himself that they cared nothing for the wrongs of downtrodden nations. They listened to his tales of war readily, but seemed to ask themselves what he had got out of it after all. There was nothing that they could see. "We wanted nothing, we suffered for the love of all humanity," he cried out furiously sometimes, and the powerful voice, the blazing eyes, the shaking of the white mane, the brown sinewy hand pointing upwards as if to call heaven to witness, impressed his hearers. After the old man had broken off abruptly with a jerk of the head and a movement of the arm, meaning clearly, "But what's the good of talking to you?" they nudged each other. There was in old Giorgio an energy of feeling, a personal quality of conviction, something they called terribilita, an old lion, they used to say of him. Some slight incident, a chance word, would set him off talking on the beach to the Italian fishermen of Maldonado. In the little shop he kept afterwards, in Valparaiso, to his countrymen customers. Of an evening suddenly in the cafe at one end of the Casa Viola, the other was reserved for the English engineers, to the select clientele of the engine drivers and foremen of the railway shops. With their handsome, bronzed, lean faces, shiny black ringlets, glistening eyes, broad-chested, bearded, sometimes a tiny gold ring in the lobe of the ear, the aristocracy of the railway works listened to him, turning away from their cards or dominoes. Here and there a fair-haired Basque studied his hand meantime, waiting without protest. No native of Costaguana intruded there. This was the Italian stronghold. Even the Sulaco policemen on a night patrol let their horses pace softly by, bending low in the saddle to glance through the window at the heads in a fog of smoke. And the drone of old Giorgio's declamatory narrative seemed to sink behind them into the plain. Only now and then the assistant of the chief of police, some broad-faced, brown little gentleman with a great deal of Indian in him, would put in an appearance. Leaving his man outside with the horses, he advanced with a confident, sly smile, and without a word up to the long trestled table. He pointed to one of the bottles on the shelf. Giorgio, thrusting his pipe into his mouth abruptly, served him in person. Nothing would be heard but the slight jingle of the spurs. His glass emptied, he would take a leisurely, scrutinizing look all around the room, go out, and ride away slowly, circling towards the town. End of chapter 4. Part First, Chapter 5 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part First, The Silver of the Mine. Chapter 5. In this way only was the power of the local authorities vindicated amongst the great body of strong-limbed foreigners who dug the earth, blasted the rocks, drove the engines for the progressive and patriotic undertaking. In these very words, 18 months before, the Excelentísimo Señor Don Vincente Ribiera, the dictator of Costaguana, had described the National Central Railway in his great speech at the turning of the first sod. He had come on purpose to Sulaco, and there was a 1 o'clock dinner party, a convite offered by the O.S.N. Company on board the Juno after the function on shore. Captain Mitchell had himself steered the cargo lighter, all draped with flags, which in tow of the Juno's steam launch took the Excelentísimo from the jetty to the ship. Everybody of note in Sulaco had been invited. The 1 or 2 foreign merchants, all the representatives of the old Spanish families then in town, the great owners of the estates on the plain, grave, courteous, simple men, caballeros of pure descent, with small hands and feet, conservative, hospitable, and kind. The Occidental Province was their stronghold. Their Blanco party had triumphed now. It was their president dictator, a Blanco of the Blancos, who sat smiling urbanely between the representatives of 2 friendly foreign powers. They had come with him from Santa Marta to countenance by their presence the enterprise in which the capital of their countries was engaged. The only lady of that company was Mrs. Gould, the wife of Don Carlos, the administrator of the San Tome silver mine. The ladies of Sulaco were not advanced enough to take part in the public life to that extent. They had come out strongly at the great ball at the Intendencia the evening before, but Mrs. Gould alone had appeared a bright spot in the group of black coats behind the president dictator, on the crimson cloth-covered stage erected under a shady tree on the shore of the harbour, where the ceremony of the turning of the first sod had taken place. She had come off in the cargo lighter, full of notabilities, sitting under the flutter of gay flags, in the place of honour by the side of Captain Mitchell, who steered, and her clear dress gave the only true festive note to the sombre gathering in the long, gorgeous saloon of the Juno. The head of the chairman of the railway board from London, handsome and pale in a silvery mist of white hair and clipped beard, hovered near her shoulder, attentive, smiling, and fatigued. The journey from London to Santa Marta in mail boats and the special carriages of the Santa Marta coast line, the only railway so far, had been tolerable, even pleasant, quite tolerable. But the trip over the mountains to Sulaco was another sort of experience, in an old diligencia over impassable roads, skirting awful precipices. "We have been upset twice in one day on the brink of very deep ravines," he was telling Mrs. Gould in an undertone. "And when we arrived here at last, I don't know what we should have done without your hospitality. What an out-of-the-way place Sulaco is, and for a harbour, too. Astonishing. Ah, but we are very proud of it. It used to be historically important. The highest ecclesiastical court for 2 viceroyalties sat here in the olden time," she instructed him with animation. "I am impressed. I didn't mean to be disparaging. You seem very patriotic. The place is lovable, if only by its situation. Perhaps you don't know what an old resident I am." "How old, I wonder?" he murmured, looking at her with a slight smile. Mrs. Gould's appearance was made youthful by the mobile intelligence of her face. "We can't give you your ecclesiastical court back again, but you shall have more steamers, a railway, a telegraph cable, a future in the great world, which is worth infinitely more than any amount of ecclesiastical past. You shall be brought in touch with something greater than 2 viceroyalties. But I had no notion that a place on a sea coast could remain so isolated from the world. If it had been 1,000 miles inland now, most remarkable. Has anything ever happened here for 100 years before today?" While he talked, in a slow, humorous tone, she kept her little smile, agreeing ironically, she assured him that certainly not. Nothing ever happened in Sulaco. Even the revolutions, of which there had been 2 in her time, had respected the repose of the place. Their course ran in the more populous southern parts of the Republic, and the great valley of Santa Marta, which was like one great battlefield of the parties, with the possession of the capital for a prize, and an outlet to another ocean. They were more advanced over there. Here in Sulaco they heard only the echoes of these great questions, and, of course, their official world changed each time, coming to them over their rampart of mountains, which he himself had traversed in an old diligencia with such a risk to life and limb. The chairman of the railway had been enjoying her hospitality for several days, and he was really grateful for it. It was only since he had left Santa Marta that he had utterly lost touch with the feeling of European life on the background of his exotic surroundings. In the capital he had been the guest of the legation, and had been kept busy negotiating with the members of Don Vincente's government. Cultured men, men to whom the conditions of civilized business were not unknown. What concerned him most at the time was the acquisition of land for the railway. In the Santa Marta Valley, where there was already one line in existence, the people were tractable, and it was only a matter of price. A commission had been nominated to fix the values, and the difficulty resolved itself into the judicious influencing of the commissioners. But in Sulaco, the occidental province for whose very development the railway was intended, there had been trouble. It had been lying for ages ensconced behind its natural barriers, repelling modern enterprise by the precipices of its mountain range, by its shallow harbour opening into the everlasting calms of a gulf full of clouds, by the benighted state of mind of the owners of its fertile territory. All these aristocratic old Spanish families, all those Don Ambrosios this and Don Fernandos that, who seemed actually to dislike and distrust the coming of the railway over their lands. It had happened that some of the surveying parties scattered all over the province had been warned off with threats of violence. In other cases outrageous pretensions as to price had been raised. But the man of railways prided himself on being equal to every emergency. Since he was met by the inimical sentiment of blind conservatism in Sulaco, he would meet it by sentiment too, before taking his stand on his right alone. The government was bound to carry out its part of the contract with the board of the new railway company, even if it had to use force for the purpose. But he desired nothing less than an armed disturbance in the smooth working of his plans. They were much too vast and far-reaching and too promising to leave a stone unturned. And so he imagined to get the President Dictator over there on a tour of ceremonies and speeches, culminating in a great function at the turning of the first sod by the harbour shore. After all, he was their own creature, that Don Vincente. He was the embodied triumph of the best elements in the state. These were facts, and unless facts meant nothing, Sir John argued to himself, such a man's influence must be real, and his personal action would produce the conciliatory effect he required. He had succeeded in arranging the trip with the help of a very clever advocate who was known in Santa Marta as the agent of the Gould silver mine, the biggest thing in Sulaco, and even in the whole Republic. It was indeed a fabulously rich mine. Its so-called agent, evidently a man of culture and ability, seemed, without official position, to possess an extraordinary influence in the highest government spheres. He was able to assure Sir John that the President Dictator would make the journey. He regretted, however, in the course of the same conversation, that General Montero insisted upon going too. General Montero, whom the beginning of the struggle had found an obscure army captain employed on the wild eastern frontier of the state, had thrown in his lot with the Ribierist party at a moment when special circumstances had given that small adhesion a fortuitous importance. The fortunes of war served him marvellously, and the victory of Rio Seco, after a day of desperate fighting, put a seal to his success. At the end he emerged general, minister of war, and the military head of the Blanco party, although there was nothing aristocratic in his descent. Indeed, it was said that he and his brother, orphans, had been brought up by the munificence of a famous European traveller in whose service their father had lost his life. Another story was that their father had been nothing but a charcoal burner in the woods, and their mother a baptized Indian woman from the far interior. However that might be, the Costaguana press was in the habit of styling Montero's forest march from his commandancia to join the Blanco forces at the beginning of the troubles the most heroic military exploit of modern times. About the same time, too, his brother had turned up from Europe, where he had gone apparently as secretary to a consul. Having, however, collected a small band of outlaws, he showed some talent as a guerrilla chief, and had been rewarded at the pacification by the post of military commandant of the capital. The Minister of War, then, accompanied the Dictator. The board of the O.S.N. Company, working hand in hand with the railway people for the good of the Republic, had on this important occasion instructed Captain Mitchell to put the mailboat Juno at the disposal of the distinguished party. Don Vincente, journeying south from Santa Marta, had embarked at Cayta, the principal port of Costaguana, and came to Sulaco by sea. But the chairman of the railway company had courageously crossed the mountains in a ramshackle diligencia, mainly for the purpose of meeting his engineer-in-chief, engaged in the final survey of the road. For all the indifference of a man of affairs to nature, whose hostility can always be overcome by the resources of finance, he could not help being impressed by his surroundings during his halt at the surveying camp established at the highest point his railway was to reach. He spent the night there, arriving just too late to see the last dying glow of sunlight upon the snowy flank of Higuerota. Pillared masses of black basalt framed like an open portal a portion of the white field lying aslant against the west. In the transparent air of the high altitudes everything seemed very near, steeped in a clear stillness as in an imponderable liquid. And with his ear ready to catch the first sound of the expected diligencia, the engineer-in-chief, at the door of a hut of rough stones, had contemplated the changing hues on the enormous side of the mountain, thinking that in this sight, as in a piece of inspired music, there could be found together the utmost delicacy of shaded expression and a stupendous magnificence of effect. Sir John arrived too late to hear the magnificent and inaudible strain sung by the sunset amongst the high peaks of the Sierra. It had sung itself out into the breathless pause of deep dusk before, climbing down the forewheel of the diligencia with stiff limbs, he shook hands with the engineer. They gave him his dinner in a stone hut like a cubical boulder, with no door or windows in its two openings, a bright fire of sticks, brought on muleback from the first valley below, burning outside, sent in a wavering glare, and 2 candles in tin candlesticks, lighted, it was explained to him, in his honour, stood on a sort of rough camp table, at which he sat on the right hand of the chief. He knew how to be amiable, and the young men of the engineering staff, for whom the surveying of the railway track had the glamour of the first steps on the path of life, sat there too, listening modestly, with their smooth faces tanned by the weather, and very pleased to witness so much affability in so great a man. Afterwards, late at night, pacing to and fro outside, he had a long talk with his chief engineer. He knew him well of old. This was not the first undertaking in which their gifts, as elementally different as fire and water, had worked in conjunction. From the contact of these two personalities, who had not the same vision of the world, there was generated a power for the world's service, a subtle force that could set in motion mighty machines, men's muscles, and awaken also in human breasts an unbounded devotion to the task. Of the young fellows at the table, to whom the survey of the track was like the tracing of the path of life, more than one would be called to meet death before the work was done. But the work would be done. The force would be almost as strong as a faith. Not quite, however. In the silence of the sleeping camp upon the moonlit plateau forming the top of the pass, like the floor of a vast arena, surrounded by the basalt walls of precipices, 2 strolling figures in thick ulsters stood still, and the voice of the engineer pronounced distinctly the words, "We can't move mountains." Sir John, raising his head to follow the pointing gesture, felt the full force of the words. The white higuerota soared out of the shadows of rock and earth like a frozen bubble under the moon. All was still till nearby, behind the wall of a corral for the camp animals, built roughly of loose stones in the form of a circle, a pack mule stamped his forefoot and blew heavily twice. The engineer-in-chief had used the phrase in answer to the chairman's tentative suggestion that the tracing of the line could perhaps be altered in deference to the prejudices of the Sulaco landowners. The chief engineer believed that the obstinacy of men was the lesser obstacle. Moreover, to combat that they had the great influence of Charles Gould, whereas tunnelling under Higuerota would have been a colossal undertaking. "Ah, yes, Gould. What sort of man is he?" Sir John had heard much of Charles Gould in Santa Marta, and wanted to know more. The engineer-in-chief assured him that the administrator of the San Tome silver mine had an immense influence over all these Spanish dons. He had also one of the best houses in Sulaco, and the Gould hospitality was beyond all praise. "They received me as if they had known me for years," he said. "The little lady is kindness personified. I stayed with them for a month. He helped me to organize the surveying parties. His practical ownership of the San Tome silver mine gives him a special position. He seems to have the ear of every provincial authority, apparently, and, as I said, he can wind all the hidalgos of the province round his little finger. If you follow his advice, the difficulties will fall away, because he wants the railway. Of course, you must be careful in what you say. He's English, and besides, he must be immensely wealthy. The Holroyd house is in with him in that mine, so you may imagine." He interrupted himself as, from before one of the little fires burning outside the low wall of the corral, arose the figure of a man wrapped in a poncho up to the neck. The saddle which he had been using for a pillow made a dark patch on the ground against the red glow of embers. "I shall see Holroyd himself on my way back through the States," said Sir John. "I've ascertained that he too wants the railway." The man who, perhaps disturbed by the proximity of the voices, had risen from the ground, struck a match to light a cigarette. The flame showed a bronzed, black-whiskered face, a pair of eyes gazing straight. Then, rearranging his wrappings, he sank full length and laid his head again on the saddle. "That's our camp master, whom I must send back to Sulaco now we are going to carry our survey into the Santa Marta Valley," said the engineer. "A most useful fellow, lent me by Captain Mitchell of the O.S.N. Company. It was very good of Mitchell. Charles Gould told me I couldn't do better than to take advantage of the offer. He seems to know how to rule all these muleteers and peons. We had not the slightest trouble with our people. He shall escort your diligencia right into Sulaco with some of our railway peons. The road is bad. To have him at hand may save you an upset or two. He promised me to take care of your person all the way down, as if you were his father." This camp master was the Italian sailor whom all the Europeans in Sulaco, following Captain Mitchell's mispronunciation, were in the habit of calling Nostromo. And indeed, taciturn and ready, he did take excellent care of his charge at the bad parts of the road, as Sir John himself acknowledged to Mrs. Gould afterwards. End of chapter 5.